music, and the channel has a live stream going 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I've seen those. All right, I believe we are live.
Oh my god.
Here we go. And let me send out the tweet. There you go. All right, so I am Cypher, the Cynical Historian, and Tristan, why don't you introduce yourself and explain what your channel is devoted to.
Hello, everybody. My name's Tristan. I am the host of the channel Step Back History. Cypher and I did a 6-part series on world revolutions back in like January. But yeah, it's if you like the cynical historian, I'm a less cynical historian.
And he does a lot of he's been doing some stuff on religious history, which is fascinating. And today we're going to be talking about academic bias. There's a common complaint that I'm sure you see in the comments of your own channel that you know, everybody in the in academia is in the left, and they're all left-leaning or Marxists and all that kind of stuff. And you'll see if you guys look into the description that there is several works that we'll be using throughout this to discuss the subject. So the common complaint is, you know, there's a liberal bias in academia. So we want to talk about why that is, why, or whether or not it is, and how that affects the profession versus how that is perceived. And Tristan is particularly good to be a counterpoint because he lives in Canada, and they have a fairly different view of this subject, as well as he's also a PhD student as well.
Yep. Yeah, we have a different Overton window, and we have probably just a different political culture, and then also, but on top of that, our university system is pretty similar, so it'll be useful for comparisons.
Yeah. So let's start off with that Overton window to kind of show the difference that we oh wait, no, first we need to explain our own biases, because if we're going to be talking about bias, we better be proclaiming our own. So I'm what may be considered a centrist, probably a bit libertarian, bit socialist, kind of all over the map. And yourself?
I usually politically consider myself an anarcho-syndicalist or an anarcho-pacifist or
anarcho-pacifist. I've never heard that one.
It's an anarchist who doesn't like violence, which is a subset of the community. But
so no direct action?
No, it's complicated. I don't actually have a good. I don't think I have an answer. And anybody who says they do have an answer is lying. But I would probably just say as far left and as far libertarian as one can get, and that's usually where I lie. Whenever I do those political compassy things, I'm in the absolute bottom left corner.
Yeah, I remember in the last chat that we had, there was somebody saying that, you know, you have that your channel is the Democratic Socialist Republic of yada yada yada. Step back.
Yeah, I think that if anything, that's. I mean, when it comes to politics and history, it's hard to hide your position on things because it just informs so much of the way you think. And if anything, my like leftist Howard Zinnish point of view is what lets my channel stick out a little bit in the increasingly crowded realm. So.
Well, a lot of it focuses on, a lot of YouTube focuses on military history and, warfare and that, and you are very explicit about trying to avoid it, and especially with your recent stuff, you've been trying to point out more tolerant religions.
Yeah, the series on, like, I have a series on world religions where I'm just kind of doing a study on world religions, because YouTube is sort of full of really nasty takedowns of religions without like any discussing like, their anthropological background and what their like actual belief systems are. And I don't do things that a lot of like anti-religious videos on YouTube do, like ignore exegesis and that kind of stuff. So I try to do it just to just describe what a religion's like and talk about it in all of its interestingness, and not just as an attempt to just be bitter about religion in general.
And yeah, so we now that we've said that, it's just kind of like, yeah, we have our own biases, but the real question that that a lot of people have when they hear that or proclaim it really is that that is academia in fact left-leaning, and of course in America there's a bit of a difference between Canada. So we were talking earlier about how the left is a very different thing in Canada. So here, Hillary Clinton is on the left, whereas there it wouldn't be. So what do you see as being the key issue or at least a few key issues that define that difference between Canada and the U.S. on the Overton window?
Well, I think that, Canada would be, to first to just go onto like ground level, the Overton window is basically like the sliver of political opinion that is considered acceptable by any given society. And so Canada's would definitely be considered way to the left of the United States. Like, for example, you would be very hard-pressed to find a conservative politician in our country who does not support our single-payer healthcare system, for example. But when it comes to like not just like the politics of things going on, because there's a lot of stuff in Canada that have just been settled, while in America they stayed as like open political issues. Like, we don't have the same discussions about gay marriage and abortion or anything like that. Like, those happened, like the gay marriage decision happened in like 2005, and then it really we just forgot about it ever since. And so like I feel like there's just a different culture of political culture. Like, we don't put our politics as core to our identity, and we don't have as much of an antagonistic relationship between different political leanings, especially because we actually have third choices and things like that. So if you don't like a party, we have, I think at the moment, 5 political parties that have seats. I think that's right. So,
yeah, you guys have a lot of third party. You just did a video on I forgot the name of the Quebec movement or whatever it was called, and how that party has almost disappeared already.
Yeah, the national we have a national Quebec separatist party called the Bloc Québécois that had its peak in the mid-90s, but has today become very small because basically Quebecois people in general don't care that much about separatism anymore. That's a peculiarity of my country specifically. because we have that.
Anonymous blames Rush Limbaugh for Quebec, for the Quebec separatists. And whereas here we've had a pretty straightforward split in terms of political parties since, well, the Civil War, basically. What actual political opinions those sides hold have kind of flip-flopped over time, basically starting with Wilson and ending with Nixon. There was a period of the basically over civil rights that the two parties kind of flipped because people were leaving the Democrats because they were, old school, hardcore, support Jim Crow kind of thing. Which is funny because, I mean, when you think about it, Wilson kind of started the flip by his whole...
oh, no, we're getting you started on Woodrow Wilson again.
I did a bunch of research recently and put together a two-part script. And once I figure out some audio issues with that thing, I'll be putting it together. But I read something like 11 books just to put that thing together, so I can go on for hours.
Yeah, I think Wilson came up when you came on one of my live streams back in like March, and yeah, you have a lot to say about good old Woody Wilson.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I was saying there is he started the whole switch over to neoliberalism that his whole New Liberty was what he called it, basically turning progressivism into liberalism. That's why here we will often flip between saying liberal and progressive without any like semblance as to there being a difference. But Wilson wasn't exactly good for civil rights, but later Democrats were. And that's where the split kind of lies today, is that you have the new left pushing for multiculturalism and equality, whereas the right is, well, the Republican Party, which is really what defines our split, is what Democrats support and what Republicans support. And Republicans are supposedly tried to push for less government and less taxes, and mostly that in terms of economics, and then socially they just don't want change. And that's kind of our divide.
Yeah, in the United States, though, it feels like, at least compared to other countries, more tribal. Like, your identity behind a political party tends to be more part of one's own identity in a bigger way, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, I'm trying to think about, here I think that you'd find more door-to-door different types of political leanings, while, like, in the United States, like, your zip code very much can define your political leanings in a lot of ways.
Well, kind of if you're talking about rural country, but in the city you find that the map is actually a lot more purple than the Electoral College would make it look. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to have people even living right next door to each other and be feuding over some political issue. And I mean, that's almost everyone, actually. While there are definitely places that lean that are more blue than red, or vice versa, or whatever, you'll find that oftentimes it's like 51% versus 49, rather than 90 versus 10.
Okay. I guess it just I guess like if I were to like I'm just trying to nail down this definition of this difference, then I guess like just like there's political issues where disagreement feels like it's more than just like I have a different interpretation on things than you do.
Yeah, a lot of our politics kind of go by brand loyalty. What is the current stance of the party that you are affiliated with, and you take up that side. Whereas I would guess that that's not really the case in Canada.
No, not as much. I don't think people identify as much with a political party, period. Like the only time we really care about what's going on is really when elections happen. So, and our elections are only like 3 weeks long. So it's only for a little bit that we actually care about things, and people are way more likely to switch parties based on what they like and what the candidates are like and that kind of thing. So I just feel like it's a different approach. Maybe it's our our loyalist parliamentary whatever.
Yeah, and heck, on the last election, if it weren't for Trump coming in and just ruining everything, I was just going to be a single issue voter on purely, had nothing really to do with politics. I just wanted easy. I was getting tired of not being able to get a hold of 22s, 22 long rifle, because people were freaking out that Obama was going to take their guns, and I was literally going to vote just on that basis. It had nothing to do with politics. I just wanted to appease the fearmongers and get back to those nice weekends when you could just go out and buy a Birkin box 22 for $20 and go plinking. But I don't think that is ever coming back.
That sounds a little terrifying, but
so what I think is the main difference between Canada and here in terms of politics is that in terms of what defines the left-right divide is that here it's about party, and that party tends, and so one party tends to just be dragging while the other one is trying to pull them along. Conservative versus progressive, and for what it seems like in terms of Canada is that there's actually a lot more fluidity in terms of what could be the center.
So could you restate that sentence? I'm just trying to put it together in my head.
Basically, we have our politics defined by party, and one party is explicitly conservative while the other is trying things, I guess, wants change, as the election a few back was saying. So no change versus change here, and there it's less easy to find a center to define.
Yeah, I think that our political spectrum is a little bit less defined in that way. We have a few political parties. Like I would probably argue that our Conservative Party is more ideological conservative than it used to be about 20 years ago. And we have a Social Democratic Party or a Democratic Socialist Party that is a bit more idealistic, but they also they tend to be in third position on government, and they tend to get a lot done by proposing things and making deals, and like they don't have to have government in order to make change. And then you have this big like centrist party that's governed the country for like something like 60 or 70% of the country's existence, and they kind of leaven the two things together, and that's like the short story, I guess, of that.
Okay. So because of that, we're going to have differing ideas in terms of what bias counts as in colleges, in academia. And so the common complaint here in America is, of course, there's a liberal bias, that there is that everybody's a Democrat in academia, and it does seem the data does seem to pan out that that there is many more registered Democrats in universities than Republicans compared to the general population. And how does that pan out in Canada with so many parties?
If I were to like actually ask about it, I probably wouldn't even know which parties most of the people that I know support or vote for. And I don't even think that most people would be identified with any in particular. The only time when we actually like talk about politics is usually when the writ's been dropped. And even then, there's a lot of room for like massive swings. So if we were to talk about like there being a like liberal or conservative like bias in our academia, it would have to be over like issues that come up. Like the big story that we've had is a U of T professor, a University of Toronto professor. I think he even made some inroads in the US, but basically he got in a lot of trouble, got kind of like publicly run through the mud because he basically kept saying that he wanted to defend his freedom of speech to intentionally misgender his students and basically be a dick to trans people. And
Wow.
because he was being censored for intentionally misgendering his students, he got a platform on a whole bunch of like far right talk shows and all those things. And then he went on free speech tours where he did not get turned away from talks or anything like that. And so like that's kind of stuff that comes up. Like you have that professor, but like I don't hear the same kind of like Hofstadterian like disdain for liberal academics like you hear in American political discourse.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it here, in terms of why it's so prominent, is that in political discourse, is that not so much that there's, well, I give away a good chunk of my opinion, not so much that there's a problem, but that there are very vocal professors who are on the left side of politics that are going to that go out and express their opinion in some public fashion that that challenges the Republican side of things.
Mm-hmm. Is it that there are like a lot of conservatives in America who just feel less of an identity with the Republican Party, specifically like the brand? Like, because the Republican Party is a bit more ideological, and so like if you're like a center-right econ professor, you might feel less inclined to say that you're a Republican than you're a conservative.
Well, that's such an interesting thing in terms of our politics, because we have well, our academic bias politics is that different departments clearly show that that there is more of a political lean in the liberal arts versus something like the business school, where when an entire university is factored in, while it will typically have more Democrats than Republicans in comparison to the general population, it will you'll have a lot more Republicans in like business and architecture and the vocational stuff, whereas liberal arts you'll find a lot more Democrats. And what makes it really weird is that there's a lot of independents in, especially like every single one of these studies that we have down in the description talks about how tough it is to even to try to figure out what those party lines are. But even when they go off of voter records and self-admitted data, that it's never as far of a bias, far of a political leaning as the conservative media would have you believe.
Man, I refuse to believe that the American conservative media exaggerates something. Just tell me about how, like, Mitt Romney's healthcare plan, when it has Obama's name on it, is all of a sudden going to kill grandma. Like,
That's why it's a lot of it is about brand loyalty. That there is also a significant factor that that these pundits like to bring to trot out in terms of bias, and that's identity politics. Whether you identify as trans or gay and all that, or you're a woman or a or black or some sort of minority or marginalized group, that there is there's supposed to be some sort of bias in the academic system towards people who support those people. It's really hard to not make these people out to be racists, but I'm giving it my best. But the main thing is that there is supposed to be some sort of benefits package, that affirmative action and things like that are driving the politics towards the left.
So I think that, okay, so it plays into a lot of things. Some of them are unique to the American, are very American, some are not. So the United States does have a long and very troubled history when it comes to race that Canada is much better at ignoring in our own history.
Chris Jones self-identifies as an internet troll.
So I think that the question about oh man, I gotta think for a little bit to formulate what I'm going to say properly. But so a lot of these universities, so the claim is that the universities give an unrealistic or an unfair advantage to people who are of these oppressed identity groups. And that then creates a university culture that is unfairly, or that is too left-wing or just more left-wing than the average. I do feel like in some ways that does treat some identity groups like they're a political monolith, which feels a little unfair. Like, I was having this conversation yesterday, actually, at a bar where we were talking about why why during the Democratic primaries, Clinton was able to make this claim that Bernie Sanders has a bad relationship with black people. And I said it's because the Republicans are so toxic to people who are of any minority group that no matter what political leaning they have, they join the Democrats. And so you can get all of these groups who have, conservatives, because there's, what race you are, or what.
But Bernie Sanders is a Democrat.
He isn't. No, he's an independent.
Well, okay, yeah, but he was running for the Democratic Party.
Yes.
No. So
did I misspeak? Did I misspeak something?
Well, it was. I thought you were saying that he wasn't liked because he wasn't a Democrat, but he was running as a Democrat.
Oh no! What I was saying is that he was. People said that he had a problem connecting with minority voters for reasons that that's something in his policies, or they implied that something in his policies were bad, but it seems like it's more that the Republican Party's done such a good job at basically kicking out anybody who's different from their party that pretty much you have of the black people in America, overwhelming support for the Democrats, but not necessarily because they're all left wing. And that's where I think that maybe there's a misapplication of ideas, is that the Republicans have just done such a bad job of not alienating everybody who's different from them, that the Democrats then have a lot of these minority groups that are of all different political persuasions, but are Democrats because there's no real other options.
Yeah, especially when you look at presidents, that definitely holds true in terms of Republicans starting to alienate their minority base. Because after all, it's the party of Lincoln. You would think would have stayed with that, but the whole switch that happened. By the time Nixon came in, it was pretty much done. But you see Nixon, Reagan, not so much the Bushes, but definitely Nixon and Reagan having policies that were fairly alienating to that minority base. But I still can't quite understand the hate for. Well, I shouldn't say hate. The reason why Democrats can't get behind, minority Democrats can't get behind Bernie Sanders. After all, he actually was part of the civil rights movement, so I never understood that.
Well, as I was saying, it was them being tricky about numbers. So you have during the Democratic Party pretty much a good size chunk of the minority race people in America. And then they're not in the party because they're ideologically left wing. They're in the party because the Republican Party is actively toxic towards them. And so conservative black people, conservative Mexicans, conservative Latino people of all stripes, because some political studies show that Latino people are actually generally more right-wing than the average in the country. But they're still Democrat identified because the Republican Party tries to say to build walls between them and whatever. So what somebody like Clinton, who is a right-wing Democrat, can do is say, oh, Bernie Sanders must be racist because, look, the black people are supporting me in huge numbers. And it's because, when it comes to, your white millennials, any right-wing white millennial is going to be a Republican, but a right-wing black millennial is not going to be a Republican. So they're in the Democratic Party as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's that the majority of, it holds true in terms of demographics, and it pushes right into academia, is that minorities and well, women, it's kind of weird, but it appears that women as well are going to be more Democrat than Republican. So the debate in terms of, well, not so much the debate, the complaint of the conservative media is that that affirmative action policies and that are forcing academia to become more left-leaning, because affirmative action programs, specifically target minorities and more marginalized identities.
Yeah, and I guess I would just take umbrage with the idea that just because you are, putting in an affirmative action program to allow more people of different minority groups and more women into universities, that you're going to shift the political spectrum, because, as I said, the Democrats have a lot of conservatives in their midst. So maybe it's like, maybe you'll have more Democrat-identified people, but you won't. I don't think you're going to shift the political leaning all that much.
Yeah, so for me, when I was looking at these studies, and especially that book, it seemed to indicate that academia hasn't really changed that much over time, and that would kind of disprove the whole affirmative action is changing. Academic is making academia more liberal biased. They all seem to indicate that if there is a change, it's subtle. The studies that have tried to say that there's been a massive shift to the left, there isn't really data they're cherry picking data most of the time. The ones that show that it's not clear, and if anything, it seems to be the same as it was 50 years ago. That is seems to be the consensus.
So then it's not really the academic, it's not really the academy that's changed, but it's the country that they're based in that's changed. Like, if they're politically more or less the same, but the last 4 decades, the United States has become much, much more right-wing than it has been since before.
Yeah, I could see that. The only one of these sources that actually talked about the overall change in terms of politics was Gross, but I didn't see much in terms of comparing the change in the country's politics, as if academia stayed still and country just went right. Though I could see that, especially after Reagan, when you had the technocrats like Clinton, Bill Clinton, come in and kind of court the right with semi-conservatism with their family policies, I guess you can call it.
Yeah, there's some other things you can add in there too that I think complicate matters. Like, maybe that's true in like sheer admissions, but when it comes to like support for research and support for the careers of academics, like, because of how much like money there is in conservative organizations, like I'm trying to think of a few off the top of my head, like kind of like think tanks and things like that. If you're like an openly right-wing like academic, you have way more of a support network when it comes to like funding and platform.
It kind of depends. I think, especially if you look at the history profession specifically, which, I mean, we kind of have to focus on that since that's where we are. The history profession has a lot of research grants and whatnot that target what may be deemed identity politics. You know, the whole race, class, and gender paradigm that we are basically in is that multiculturalism is kind of the main focus of study at the moment. There's been kind of like a push away from like big man history, you know, that old gem, and you know, the frontier thesis, and you know, Western historians kind of using that for American history, and so American exceptionalism, great man history, and military history. So those kind of have been getting pushed out, and that could be said to be a more left turn in the profession.
I mean, if you think about it, I like, it depends upon where you see things going. Like, I mean, it might be that history started out as a field that was very skewed in one direction, and now it's just balancing things out. And plus, a lot of this stuff that shows it's like, you know, moving into these different areas of historical research could just be a sign that we're developing as a discipline new ways of looking at sources. There's like, I'm trying to remember the book now off the top of my head, but there's a really great book that looks at American government and political structure based on cultural history, and it's because we have these new ways of reading sources that are a lot more like sophisticated than like in the 1960s, where like, you know, you read a few books by a few, like in like the early days in the historical discipline, you really only saw as sources things that were like written by powerful people, and that was basically all you could base everything on. But like over time, we've kind of developed our methodologies, and so like any other discipline, like I don't know why it's called it. I don't know why like we don't have revisionist science when we added quantum mechanics to physics, or like revision, like, you know, like it's just, it's a discipline, and historians have been building upon each other's work for decades. And like any other discipline, yeah, we have moments where like a group of thinkers who are focused in a different way kind of backlash against the people who came before them and do something new. And like, that's true of all disciplines.
Yeah, but there's also kind of a unlike, you know, science, where you can claim that, you know, politics doesn't matter. There's no politics in science. I'm sure somebody is already scoffing at that statement, but the, you know, with things like climate change being politicized, it's politicized outside of academia, whereas with history, you don't get to have that separation between politics and your scholarship, because your scholarship undergirds a bunch of political ideologies.
Yep, that's probably why both of us get so many of our videos demonetized.
Yeah, that, which, by the way, I'm guessing because of that video I put out a couple of days ago, the two videos I was complaining about being demonetized after having already been reviewed and kept their demonetization, like just a few hours after that video went up, suddenly they were remonetized.
Yeah, they seem a little faster now. I did see that there was a meeting where they don't, like, YouTube knows that there's a problem with their demonetization feature. And I still have a suspicion that it is because I know how machine learning algorithms work, and I imagine it's a machine learning algorithm that's learning incorrectly. So that's, I think they're aware of it, but we're getting aside ourselves.
Yeah. So, well, I actually kind of lost track. We were Oh, talking about differences in subject of study. Yeah. So we were talking about how history is inherently political. No matter what we do, we can't undo that. But at the same time, does that mean that we are doing something? Are we changing the history? Are revisionists wrong?
All right. I'm about to use some language that I know that I'm just going to watch the chat blow up as I talk about it, but I'm going to pull out Mr. Foucault for a second.
Oh boy. I got a few books on the shelf right there.
Let's talk about postmodernism and how we know the things we know. I think that if you were to look at the long history of history, it's this field that has attempted to be a science and failed over and over again, because what we do is look at our evidence is in language and in construction and in so many different things that essentially all we can ever do, we're never like, it's not like, for example, like we know that 2 + 2 is 4 because there's no politics about, there's no like interpretation. You can't reinterpret 2 to be 1 or 3. It's just always
the system itself. The system of numbers itself means 1 + 1 is 2. It's not that there is a wrong answer to be said. It just is.
Yes. While reading a text is different. We will never be able to objectively say 100% that something, that a text says something. And over time, we are going to be changing the way that we read text, changing the way that we understand the past with more sources and more advanced ways of looking at different things, that we're never ever going to have a perfect view of the past. We're always going to have the most modern interpretation possible of the past. And that means that 50 years from now, when we have a completely different society, we're going to read texts from the past differently than we read them today, because we'll change collectively. And so you're never like, so things are always going to be changing in history. We're always going to be reinterpreting. We're always going to be unearthing new facts, because unless we invent a time machine, we're never going to be able to say, oh no, this is exactly what was going on in this period at this time. And it all comes down to the fact that we use human-created sources.
Yeah. So yeah. The idea that subjectivity requires revisionism is yeah, I kind of agree. Is that if we are going to base history on telling stories, which, I mean, that's what it is, and it has to be true stories. The problem is the only way we can do it is through using evidence that is inherently unreliable. And so there will always be room for interpretation in terms of whether or not you believe something. There's a lot of subjectivity that we have just in critique, and then there's also bringing in new data, which a lot of history, a lot of new interpretations are done through simply saying, like, let's look at it from a different person's perspective. Oh wait, hey, here's some sources that were previously not known. I was just reading Eugene Bolton, the creator of where did I put that book at? It's called The Spanish Borderlands, but the his entire stance against the frontier thesis in that is based on going to Mexico and using their sources to talk about the Spanish borderlands. Kind of lost you there for a second.
Oh, sorry. My cat was running around the house.
And so there's those two sources of subjectivity that we can never get rid of.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with this with my supervisor once, where we actually rationalized to the point where we wouldn't even be able to objectively write about the past, even if we had a time machine, because often historians write about like large changes in processes over big periods of time, and there's like no point you can go to talk about. Let's like use one of the videos I did for our series as an example. Like there's no talking about the development of mercantile capitalism that led to the kind of discombobulation of the extremely centralized absolute monarchies in like the late 18th century. Like it's like,
I think Braudel would disagree with you on that.
Like you couldn't go back to a point in the past to say one way or another whether or not that was a factor. It involves like reading a lot of things and making inferences and
so I think that we're both basically hitting around the same thing, is that revisionism is not a bad thing necessarily, although it's normally used as a derogatory term, but in historiography it's just kind of been accepted. It's like Yankee Doodle was originally an insult, but now I'm a proud Yankee. The profession has kind of embraced the term revisionist.
Yeah, I think though that one of the things that is really important for us to talk about when it comes to history specifically, and this is where I think our discipline gets the specific run through the mud, is that history's always had this, because history was born in the late 19th century like nation moment and the like rise of nationalism, and that history began as these like these Annales School really long like national stories, and history has a large role in nation building. And I think that as history becomes more, or as it evolves as an academic discipline to get away from nation and nationality, the people who saw their past as part of their overall national story are going to feel like their identity is being challenged because of the update in the science. Like how a lot of conservatives who are anti-climate change aren't opposing it because they actually legitimately have issues with the science, but it's because they don't like what climate change represents economically.
Yeah. It's funny that you, of course, we're talking about nationalism here, and you bring up their challenging their identity, which the conservative media's complaint with academia is that it's bringing in identity politics more so than it should be, or so on and so forth. But then their real complaint is that it's challenging their identity. It's challenging that national identity. I get comments all the time from the slavery video of how dare you say that about a white nation? You're a disgrace to white people. And it's funny, the people who complain about identity politics are very much complaining about their identities being challenged.
Yep. And if there's actually a really great video, if anybody wants to go check out Philosophy Tube, that basically boils down politics in general to just say that really there is no separating identity from politics, and there's really no
that came out just a few weeks ago, didn't it?
I think he's talked about it several times, but there's really no separating your perspective from the identity you grew up in, because it's not something, not all the time, it's not something you choose for yourself, it's something that is ascribed to you. And so it's hard to not be part of an identity when our social fabric kind of relies on it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and getting back to the profession, we kind of the entire study of history kind of is. I think it was actually Nietzsche who said this: that it's the graveyard of ideas. That history is much better at challenging than the study of history is much better at challenging ideas than supporting them. And so when it comes to being politically biased in terms of the scholarship and that, it's easier to be to go after race, class, and gender right now, because that is where critique may lie.
Yeah, historians are just people who really love saying, "Well, actually."
Yeah, I mean, we love that word context. Then, like, there's it always has context always has a way of blunting one's ideology.
Yeah, and when you attack things like ideology in like the broad sense and like national mythology and those kinds of things, people take it as an attack on their identity, and that's why I think there is like a large backlash whenever you try to say strange, like when you try to take someone down a peg, like when you demythologize a character in history or something like that. And I can't speak for all disciplines, but I imagine that's where a lot of the idea that like, oh, the academy is just a bunch of liberals can come from, because it's like tearing down a kind of comfortable conservatism in general is like a anti-change type of position, and so changing things in general is going to be seen as disruptive and challenging.
Yeah, I think I think history is always, well, I shouldn't say always. I mean, you have folks like Kant and Hegel and the Ronchian sorts who were trying to build up nationalism, but even at that point in time, you still had people challenging those kinds of things. You had folks like Marx and his followers who were who were using history to challenge things. I mean, we can argue about how well, but the purpose was there. And I don't think that's ever really gone away. I don't think we've always had the kind of nationalist history, but there's always been that undercurrent of using context to kind of blunt ideology. You had the pragmatist revolt in the 1920s and 30s, and you know, folks like the Beards and Becker were very much using their more left-leaning politics in academia and to influence their scholarship and use it to make scholastic claims.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's somewhat of the nature of scholarship is that it will challenge the status quo, and as such always be somewhat left-leaning.
Yeah, I can get behind that. I also know that like there's in some more radical circles in history right now, not like radical in politics, but like people who are trying to like really rethink the field. I have heard the occasional discussion about us trying to move as a discipline away from like using the nation as the chief category for our focus of research. Like, I'm sure you've heard a little bit about people trying to move from away from like early American history to like Atlantic studies or like Creole studies or like trying to get like states out of the center focus, which
trying to stop focusing on American exceptionalism, right?
Yeah, I did a master's in American Studies before I did U.S. history, and American Studies was trying to like American exceptionalism and trying to undermine it in narratives is really pernicious and difficult.
Yeah, and also just even trying to define what a nation is and how to and when it begins. I like Hobsbawm for this, who was definitively a Marxist, but as I seem to have to say on my channel a lot, is bias does not mean incorrect. And Hobsbawm wrote, gosh, what? I have too many books. It's like it's called like Imagined Communities or something like that.
Oh, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities?
Oh, that's Anderson. Okay. Didn't Hobsbawm write something along the same lines?
Maybe.
The main thing on that is saying that like the entire idea of nationhood is predicated on a group self-identifying as a group, and that doesn't really happen until after 1848. And so the idea of nations is really new. And nations, as a consequence, are also really new, which also means that how do you do a national history of something that didn't exist in the 16th century when you're trying to study ancient Rome or something like that?
Yeah, and I think that if there's going to be a next really big step, this for the people in the chat, like this is the kind of thing that historians talk about, like at late at night when you've had 6 or 7 beers in you. Like this is like the stuff that the discipline's going to have to tackle in the next like several decades. I think it's like the next big step to try to like get out of the nation focus, because yeah, history was kind of born in the nation building moment. And
okay, I just got to point out Cletus223 posted I'd like to know where he got that, but he posted the ratios of Democrat to Republican, which yeah, it sounds about right from what I've read in some of the liberal arts. Very useful comment there.
mm-hmm. But yeah, I think that history has played a role in the perpetuation of the concept of nation, and maybe that's the future of our field, is to get ourselves out of it.
Yeah. So one of the things that a lot of these conservative things are media pundits are complaining about is the shift to what's often called new history. A lot of people just call it revisionism. You're a fan of Howard Zinn. He's kind of the poster boy of it. But that idea that it's switched over to from being glorifying to being vilifying. That the profession used to be very optimistic about where things were going or about the past, and now it's studying how racist, how bigoted or sexist or whatever the past was, and so that's what they're often complaining about, is that historians are complaining about things, so therefore they're complaining about historians complaining.
Yeah, and so that would depend upon how much you like or don't like the concept of like looking at things in a Hegelian sense. Like, do you, like Howard Zinn would have argued that he wasn't subtracting from these people's good sides by writing about their bad sides, but he was sort of trying to add so that you could balance out the two columns, you know? And is that kind of writing considered a good thing? Is like focusing on the negative when you feel like there's been too much focus on the positive? Is that the good way to go about writing, or should you try to just be balanced in your own work? And it's a hard. I could see valid arguments for both sides.
Yeah.
So,
but I also think that it's not as clear cut when it. I mean, yes, it does seem that that the new history, the new left history, has been mostly seeking to blame something. But at the same time, you have early ones that became so, like where the paradigm for American exceptionalism went after the destruction of Turner, basically, went all over the place. But one of them was Bolton, and having literally just finished reading all he seems to be doing is saying, like, yeah, America's great, but Spain was cool too. He's not so much denigrating American history as promoting something else. So I have to wonder how much of that revisionist paradigm is because of growing focus.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think if you have an answer for that, there's a big prize in it for you.
And you are a lucky man.
Yeah, if you answer that question and write a book about it, you're going to get so many awards and speaking engagements. Because you basically solved history.
Yeah, and so part of the bias that we're worried about is that there's an institutional push for revisionism, and people want that nationalist history to continue. That Orthodox history is, I've turned it in the previous episode, and that previous Orthodox history is basically being pushed out, which I don't see that as being incorrect.
Yeah, it's like when in the past, when, you know, in other disciplines, when a new predominant theory takes place, you have to kind of rewrite all of the rules because the new theory makes other things irrelevant. But this is actually a big part of my dissertation, is this thought process, because there is always going to be a tension between what academic historians are doing and what the collective history or the collective narrative is going to be, because their goals are for different purposes. And so like my dissertation actually works on like how do we build collective narratives? How do we decide what's going to be the orthodox history at any given time? So I might be able to say more about it if you're still doing streams in 2019, 2020.
Yeah, and I think, we don't know where the profession will ultimately be in, a decade or two, and it could very easily be that it switches to being more glorifying. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but we're historians. We're not forecasters.
Mm-hmm. Most take umbrage to the entire concept of forecasting.
Yeah. No, I keep on saying paradigm because I'm basically referencing Kuhn over and over again. Or Kuhn, is it Kuhn or Kuhn?
I think it's Kuhn.
But Kuhn's whole paradigmatic model is that once something comes in, it's hard to challenge it, but eventually it will be. And so conservative pundits are complaining that this new paradigm that has basically been instituted since the 1960s, that's focused on race, class, and gender as its primary subject matter, that there's no way to enter academia because there's an inherent bias if you have a differing idea. And do you think that's true?
It depends upon the situation. Like, I think that when I think about the discussions I've had in like the seminar courses I've taken specifically, like, it depends upon what kind of conservative you mean. Like, in conservative, and like you're going to be, talking, saying nasty things just about, undermining the humanity of people who aren't like part of your race and gender, then yeah, you're going to be considered pretty uncomfortable because there's no room anywhere for like racist and sexist crap. But like, I'm trying to think of like a conservative liberal fight that doesn't come down to that. And I'm thinking like in the history of capitalism and like the history of like revolutions, like I haven't heard of like any times where, if anything, I've had more times where I've been the person targeted for not for being too into like discussions about power and class when we're supposed to be talking about individual psychology or something like that. I don't know. I think that it would depend upon the group you're in, because these tend to be very small, and the office culture of the departments that they're in. Because as I was saying before we started up, that like I actually am in a fairly conservative university and a fairly conservative history department.
Yeah, whereas we have in a lot of history departments. I've been in 3 different history departments, and you'll have fairly avowed left-leaning folks. You'll have avowed Marxists and avowed anarchists, and that take up prominent positions within the department. So I mean, obviously, there's definitely that left lean, but I don't really think that academia isn't set up to just kind of reconfirm its own bias, which is what they're complaining about. It's set up specifically to debate, to constantly challenge with new scholarship and new evidence, and so I not only think that it's easy to enter the profession. Well, it's difficult to enter the profession no matter what, because well, it's requires a heck of a lot of work, but in terms of if you put out the same amount of work as somebody who's fairly left-leaning and you're right-leaning, and you have some new thing that actually challenges the paradigm, I don't think you're going to be shut out. I think you're going to have new, a lot of opportunity, actually.
Yeah, I've noticed my experience in graduate history course in general is that if you, as long as you're not creating a toxic environment, like for the most part, they encourage you to follow wherever your intellect leads you. And usually if there's a debate between left and right wing discussions, you might be a little outnumbered sometimes depending upon where the discussion's going, but there's nobody who would say, turn down your dissertation because it talked about a white guy or like anything like that. But I don't know. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, so there's a few. Which one was it? I think it was Salas. I think maybe I'm not going to be able to find it quickly, but one of them was talking about gave some specific times in which professors like assigned people to go and like protest the Iraq War, or were but in each of those there was disciplinary action against the professor. So there is not only an inherent, and there is obviously that more left-leaning bias in at least in the American history profession, but it can be challenged. And even when it does become overbearing, that overstepping of bounds is denounced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if there's anything that you can say about academics is that they love picking fights, like whenever possible. So like, I don't know if you could ever have a ruling paradigm at any university for too long, because then someone's just going to say something.
Okay, sorry, got distracted by some of the comments. But sorry, what did you say?
Basically, it's just saying that academics tend to just start fights whenever they feel like something is too status quo, and so I can't imagine there being like a permanent left-wing status quo at a university, because then you'd find people who challenge that status quo, because that's how academics do.
Yeah, and even if it is identified as being more left-leaning always, I mean, the history profession is always built to challenge, and even itself is the thing. It challenges itself.
Yeah, and some positions that would maybe be considered right-wing positions just tend to not survive long in academia because they are not on the solidest of foundations. And there is a lot of, at least as far as I can think of, there are a lot of very right-wing positions that work well in the realm of, arguing in politics, but don't work very well in the place where you have to form cogent arguments that aren't like pathos type things, like they don't stand up to much evidence and such.
Yeah, it's
especially Republican like capital R Republican America right now, they are a party that has a lot of arguments that are more based on evoking the emotion. And this is not even things that, this is things that they don't even deny. Like Newt Gingrich, I think at the RNC was even saying like, yeah, it might not be true, but that's what people are feeling.
Yeah, and Newt Gingrich is a classic example of why this whole like academia that has a liberal bias doesn't exactly fit, because Newt Gingrich is a historian. He was even a professor. So he was a member of academia, and yet he is a prominent member of the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, my most hated politician, Wilson, was also was fairly right-leaning when it came to social issues, and was the president of Princeton.
Yeah.
So a lot of prominent historians who end up going into politics end up being conservative.
Yeah, it's Newt Gingrich's whole colonizing the moon thing. It's like you have to either have way too little or way too much education to propose something like that.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with a former roommate, and we were talking about you know, what you learn as a historian and that, and he like just offhandedly like, well, there should be more historians who are politicians, and I was just like, no. Like, we don't make good politicians.
No, any historian that becomes a politician would be way too timid, because they're afraid.
Except for the ones that have, and it's like they don't have a good history on that.
Yep. So I think we've wrapped up all of the major talking points we went through, but there have been a lot of chat questions.
Yes.
I'm not sure which ones we want to actually delve into, but
yeah. First, I want to say sorry we haven't been directly answering any of the chat questions. We wanted to get through this subject first. Been going for an hour now, so I think we can switch over to directly answering some of the questions.
Yeah.
So let's see here. Somebody was asking about South Korea for a while in there.
Oh yeah.
Girl, I think.
Yeah, he's a regular in my streams.
So he's talking about who want to change, want to teach history, and so that so changing curriculums is what he's asking about.
Yeah, I think that the history curriculum thing, that's a debate that comes up a lot whenever we talk about textbooks and stuff. And that is, I think, the front lines when that idea of history as academic discipline versus history as nation-building project, that's like where they hit each other like head on. And that's why you end up with, what was that crazy thing that happened in Texas where like they had a textbook where they called slaves like imported migrants or something like that? It was something weird. It was like...
What?
There was some textbook that Texas was going to buy for its history curriculum where they refused to use the word slave and slavery, and they called them like unwilling imported migrants or something like that.
There's an excellent book called Imperfect History or something like that. Let me try to... Past Imperfect by something Hoffer. Peter Hoffer. I have it digitally, unfortunately, so I can't just wave it around. But he has an entire chapter on this big thing, and basically what the big coming out party for revisionism when people really took issue was this series of events. First, the when the Enola Gay exhibit was done at the Smithsonian. You probably have heard of that. I think it's in 1991 or something like that. Oh, great, it doesn't have easy dates. Anyways, there was concern about what that represented, and then there was Texas was doing another run of textbooks, and that turned into this whole because they were trying to make I think it was called the national standard, and so they were trying to make a standard textbook that that would be assigned to all history classes throughout the country, and you know how that can turn, and it turned bad real quick.
Yeah, I think though that if I were to like propose a solution of any, it's that we need to start teaching history more as a verb than a noun, and get more people looking at primary sources and making inferences and making those connections rather than having like a book full of all the facts. But
yeah, so kind of like I picked these up a while ago because they're supposed to be textbooks. They're supposed to be textbooks, but they're essentially just organized primary sources. And I've never seen this assigned anywhere, but it's designed to be basically nothing but primary sources. There's some, introductory text in that, and there's always going to have to be some sort of interpretation there. And there's, of course, comparative questions and that. But these things, there's no want to assign this kind of thing in classes, it appears.
Yeah, I think because it undermines the nation-building project in some ways. Yeah, I mean, I like Eric Foner's textbook. He did a pretty good job with.
Yeah.
I think I have like. I think I have at least like 4 or 5 copies of it.
Yeah, I lost my my second volume, but and the funny thing is, just to show you that, just to show the audience that there isn't consensus within the profession on basically anything. Let me try to find one of my markings on this, but I like savagely marked this thing up in certain places. We just red marks all over the place. And those are, I literally got out a red pen because I was angry and, no, this is wrong. But Foner is really well respected within the profession. He was even American Historical Association president.
Yeah.
And
he has another book that he put together too, which is called American History Now, which is a pretty good collection of essays basically showing where the field is at this current moment. And that's a pretty good one. We do have questions about sociology research methods taking over the history field, like psychology research methods dominating poli-sci.
So basically, how much is there? This is Tyler Frum, or Frum. I don't know how to say her name, man. So he's basically asking if there's a lot of what's it called, interdisciplinary work being done. And is that interdisciplinary work changing the history profession?
Yes, and it's good. My dissertation is about applying things that come from like computer science and like big data to history. Like history is one of the greatest things about history specifically, but about being an academic is that you can grab things from different fields and you can learn new things. That's how we all grow. If we didn't borrow from each other, it'd be kind of gross. But I'm not sure where the thing that people are getting worried about is.
Well, I mean, there is the question of so, like for sociology, for instance, I happen to have a mother who teaches it, who is a professor in it, so I'm going to be able to speak a lot more about that. There is a lot of differing standards that would make the profession kind of difficult. So, like, they have I forgot what it's called. These committees that basically you have to go through that approve your sources and how much you're making your sources anonymous. So it's to protect people's when you are doing surveys and that, and they have to be anonymous and things along those lines. And in history, that's viewed as a fairly bad thing. So I could see that being a concern, that that standards and practices from other professions, once their theory gets ported over, their standards also come along with those theories and start screwing with the history profession.
Yeah, and it'll be complicated. It's a mess, but that's what being an academic basically is, isn't it? Like, those difficult waters are kind of why it takes so long to get a PhD, for example.
Yeah, and it's ultimately just another tool. The sociology, anthropology, like Geertz is super. I really like using Geertz's whole deep description method, and he was an anthropologist. He was but that style of writing impacts my own. But it's just a tool. It's not something that is going to destroy the profession.
And it's not like other people who do it differently from you are wrong or anything like that. Like, it's like, I don't do military history.
Oh, and we have a question on that.
Yeah, I don't do military history so much, not because, like, I don't think military history is worth doing. I just feel like it's been overdone, especially in, like, places like History Media on YouTube and such.
Yeah, and I think part of the question, I'm guessing your name is Jorge or George? It's
Jorge 6207.
Yeah. So he's asking, why is military history so underrated in academia? Why is military history kind of moving out of the profession? Because I mean, there's no lack of writing in terms of military history, but why is it not in academia? Why is it moving to more public history or popular history?
I mean, I think that the people who study it academically go into something called war studies now. I think that maybe the problem is that it's like not really. It's history, but like it's kind of like it feels so like 19th century, like focusing too much on something like just like battles and who won them and how they moved and stuff like that. Like, it only gets you so far. Like, there's a really great crash course history video where they knew that, like, they did 2 episodes in the Civil War, and then they knew that, like, they couldn't get away with not mentioning the battles. And so they mentioned all the battles, and they're like, all right, we did them all. Now, what did you learn?
They literally just, like, listed all of them, right?
Yeah.
I remember that.
Like, I think that, like, the heyday of military history was back when, like, historians were, like, leaf collectors. Like, they just collected big, like, big collections of information and just wrote
like,
them down.
A lot of them were like antiquarians, and but then it means that it was always kind of a pop history, pop and public history rather than academic history. That they for some people who might not know, public history is not are historians who, like, we basically do public history.
Yeah.
We're not producing this content for academia. We're producing this for YouTube. This is, but we're also doing it less to be popular, but more to be scholastic, right? So, so that's public history. Pop history is just kind of writing for the fun of it.
Yeah, for-profit history. Sometimes it's really good. Like Jill Lepore is a really popular and really good writer. And then sometimes it's just like, I think the example of pop history I always get are just those 700-page books about like the Third Reich or something. Like something that you're writing for profit that people are going to want to buy.
Yeah. And so military history will never go away from popular and public history, but yeah, I think academia has kind of moved away, not because of inherent bias or anything, but more because there's not a lot of good analysis to be done that hasn't already been done. Like one of my passions is American small wars, and I guess you could call that military history, but I'm not concerned about battles and what general moved troops where and all that kind of stuff, and I don't really care about seeing troop movements on a map. What I care about is the cause and effect, the why did it happen and what did it do.
Yeah, so it's more like that military history is just kind of from a different era of the field, and now as we've like kind of matured, it's become a part of a bigger thing. Like, because we stopped asking what and started asking why more often.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm literally repeating what I said on what I'm going to be saying next week on the episode. No, it's coming out at the end of September. Never mind. But we can't avoid warfare when we study history. Like we're not, like, military history still matters, but and studying warfare and that matters, but it's just kind of taken on a different purpose than traditional military history.
Yeah, and I think that traditional military history just was always kind of for hobbyists who have little models and maps on their walls and stuff. Yeah,
and what's there is still room for academic military history. I've got a couple of professors who actually are military historians. So they're still there. It's not like it's completely gone, but the orientation has changed. I think even in places like West Point and that, you'll find that military historians are less focused on troop movements and who won what battle, and more on how strategies affected the war in general, like what was done by people rather than like movements on a board.
Yep, I think my department is a specialty in military history. So we have a lot of military history. We have like a world-renowned Canadian World War I expert in our department that always has like a whole bunch of grad students, and his study, I think, is more about how World War I affected the idea of Canada as a state, like how we didn't have a nationalism, and how countries that were like in the Dominions sort of used World War I to develop a nationalism and to do nation building. And this is why Canada and Australia are like the countries that actually make the biggest deals about World War I for some reason, which feels strange.
So Gabriel Garcia is asking about the Wilson thing. Yes, I earlier in the stream I said that I have a script for 2 parts that I have to figure out how I'm going to film with this echoey room that I have now. But the script is ready.
Yeah.
So I think we pretty much covered why military history isn't mattering, isn't as well represented in the history profession anymore. It's just because the profession has kind of grown out of it.
And there's also more competition. Like, there's just more historians doing more different things, and that it's going to become a small percentage as the field diversifies and grows.
Yeah, and also in terms of competition, pop history has gotten a lot better. You know, when you had pop historians who in the 19th century wouldn't really be using any references, they'd just be telling the story and kind of make up quotes, or if they did use quotes, it wouldn't be, there'd be no citation. But even now, most pop history, I mean, you'll still get folks like, what's the guy who just got fired from Fox for, he used to be their head man?
Oh gosh, Bill O'Reilly.
Bill O'Reilly, yeah. He has a few history books, but they don't really use citation, even though they're ghostwritten and that.
But what about Rush Revere?
The what?
Rush Revere, the Rush Limbaugh children's book about the American Revolution. It's a real thing.
Okay. I guess something like that has to exist, but no. But pop history, besides folks like that, typically will have a lot of citation in that. So there's actually pretty good competition against academic history by pop historians now. So, you know, just let them do their thing. That's another piece of why military history isn't as big of a thing.
Yep. Should we do one more question?
Yeah,
we're fighting over whether or not America is socialist or capitalist. So just scroll up a little bit.
Yeah, it's not pure capitalism, of course. But
pure capitalism only exists in places like what was that city called in BioShock?
Rapture.
Yeah, that's pure capitalism.
or the one that's in the clouds, Infinite.
New Columbia or something.
Yeah, New Columbia.
But BioShock.
I mean, you want to talk about exploitation?
Yeah.
That was like hyper capitalism if it's purely based on that.
Well, have you ever read In Praise of Forgetting? I have read In Praise of Forgetting.
I haven't.
It is a book where the central thesis is that we're a little too attached to our history, and it limits us in what we think is possible and what we for example, I'm using it in my 9/11 research to say that we built up 9/11 to such a big thing in our heads that it seems like now we're never going to be able to move past the war on terror unless we somehow find a way to put 9/11 behind us, and we are unable to do so. It's memory studies, which is in my area.
Yeah, well, I'm not a fan of you know, I see people in the comments of the slavery episode all the time saying like, well, why are you even bringing this up? Freaking, we should just get past it. And it's like, well, you don't get past it by ignoring it.
Mm-hmm. There's a dwelling though. Like there's in some ways like America's legacy of the Civil War has led to them dwelling in ways, but like, I wouldn't say to forget about it in any way, but just that it's kind of like it's like a trauma in the national memory. And like, you don't forget about trauma to get over it, but you like have to find a way to contextualize it in the past.
Yeah.
And
it's an interesting way of putting it, that Civil War as trauma. The Civil War debates today.
Yeah, and I argue that 9/11 and a lot of the reasons why the war on terror seems like it'll never end is kind of in the same vein. It's like this it's very similar to how people process post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, I just got a text message from a friend saying that that he is having trouble, that you're having like a buffer issue or something, but I'm hearing you just fine.
Oh no.
Can everybody hear Tristan? Like, can somebody say if they're catching a buffer issue?
If not, then this video is infinitely better because
So we have some guys saying, yeah, everybody's saying that. Okay, good.
All right. So let's have one more question that we can both answer, and then we can.
So one question that is really intriguing is somebody asked. I'm trying to find it again. The what makes a good? Yeah, Julian Swanson asks, what makes a good history book?
Ooh.
So, yeah, because this actually does play into the main theme of the video, which is academic bias, as in, because as I've stated multiple times already, bias isn't incorrect, but what makes something correct, and even further, what makes it good, and does, because you could see that a good history book is simply that one that plays into the current biases of the profession. But I don't think any academic's going to agree with that.
No, unless they're really postmodernist. Like, that's like next level postmodernist. That's when you exist outside of time.
You start experiencing reality like Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah. A good history, it depends upon what you're doing. Like, I think there are some really great history books that are great because they're either exposing or exploring something that hasn't been given form before. And I think that those are usually really great. Like, I think one of my favorites is A Midwife's Tale, which was this amazing piece of American historiography where this historian was able to take a book that most people had not looked at because it was just like the daily diary of a midwife. And just through like her writing down about who she met and what she did, was able to piece together this amazing narrative about what the midwife profession was like in this very specific part of American history. And it was like using sources in novel ways, and it was really
sounds a lot like a micro history.
Yeah, it's basically like the seminal micro history. But I mean, there are good. What
about Cheese and the Worms?
Sorry?
What about Cheese and the Worms or the Great Cat Massacre?
I don't know those ones, but
I have Cheese and the Worms Cat Massacre, I believe, is an article. But who is this? Carlo Ginzburg. Yeah, Ginsburg is often considered to be like the beginning of microhistory, at least from what I've been taught.
Mm-hmm. But I think that, like, I don't know, it's like saying what makes a good science fiction novel. Like, there's a lot of people don't read those for a lot of different purposes, and there are a lot of different things.
But even with like something like science fiction, you can say there are some unifying things that are needed to be good. So like in science fiction, you need to be making some exploring some sort of idea, because science fiction is always about like not the science and the story itself, but like the idea. It's, a dystopia isn't about like, look how bad this is. This is like look at what it's almost like a dystopian novel is almost like a reductio ad absurdum.
Mm-hmm. So I guess then good, like solid, grounded research that is at least current, and usually, yeah, exploring ideas. Like I think that history books that are just reciting long lists of facts are, one, boring, and two, will kind of lose the forest for the trees. I think I don't know. I think that I just really like Jill Lepore. That's like my favorite history author these days.
Jill Lepore, I haven't heard that name.
Her most recent book is A History of Wonder Woman, but she did a really great book on King Philip's War that sticks out in my head a lot.
Going from King Philip's War to Wonder Woman? What?
Yeah, she's an I think she's like an NYU professor who writes books on like, who also has like, she has a column, I think, for the New York Times, and she publishes that's about history.
I just looked up. So yeah, quite a varied career.
But like her books have good narratives, but they're grounded in solid research and explore interesting things. And that's, I don't know, I think those are the things I would be most on top of.
So novelty.
At least when it comes to like things that I just want to read for my own entertainment.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like reading history for academic purposes.
Yeah, there's like a difference between good history as in like just, this is good scholarship. And that just depends on like how much evidence are you using, how much does your prose follow the actual logic of the evidence being given, and so on and so forth. That old scientific history kind of thing. But that's just purely like, how good of a scholar are you? Mm-hmm. But then there's also that more what makes it good.
Literature,
yeah. And because it can't be the same as like, if like when H.G. Wells wrote his history, that's not good history. So even when you have good authors doing history, there's got to be something more than just excellent prose.
Yeah, it's a hard balancing act, but and only a few people do it really well. And I think that's what we're trying to do, and I don't know how well we do it. Depends. Depends on the video.
Yeah. We have some that we're proud of, and some that we're just kind of.
Yep.
And we're also kind of charting out a very new thing. Like in terms of there's a whole bunch of history YouTubers now. I started in 2013 when there wasn't as many. But even with that, a lot of history YouTubers are coming at it from a different profession. You'll have like journalists or people who are in like high school and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it does mean that it's still somewhat uncharted territory for scholars.
Yep. And that's why we have a value proposition still. Trust me, the second that like Niall Ferguson starts a YouTube channel, we're both done.
Oh, don't get me started on Ferguson.
he's another pop historian who's a real historian, but he seems to fail at both academic rigor and good writing. So I don't know.
Yeah, I'm
Shade
not a fan of
Throne,
modernization
Niall
theory.
Ferguson.
Well, I was just watching a video by I'm trying to remember that basically used I forgot the Dungeons Drums and Steel guy, Jared Diamond, and Neill Ferguson quotes them and proceeds to use this. My one problem with that is most people who deal with those subjects really despise Neill Ferguson.
And Jared Diamond. Neither of those people are taken too seriously.
Yeah, while the last couple chapters of that book are just bad, really, really bad, the whole theory of continental axes and necessities to building a civilization through particular resources are powerful, at least. And I think people discount them a little too easily. Like James Blount discounts modernization theory altogether. But he does go after Jared Diamond as well in his 8 Eurocentric historians. But I don't quite buy what his arguments as much.
Oh yeah, I just I think I might make a video someday breaking down my issues with Jared Diamond. That's been on my back burner for a long time.
Yeah,
especially because I make a lot of videos about pre-Columbian Americas, and it's like why was this civilization not as advanced as this one? It's like it's not. They weren't less advanced. It's just different stuff. It's
well, I mean, we can get into that at some other time. We don't need to get into the theory, but it does allow us a good interpretation of why America didn't conquer Europe. Not so much China, even though he tries to hit that subject later, but does try to say why the New World and Africa didn't create friggin' sea travel and guns and whatnot.
Yeah, it's almost like they lacked something. It's not, but like the thing is, like he would argue that it was like a geographic thing. It's like you haven't talked about the colonial mindset or like other culture things. Like either ways, we are running up on 2 hours now, and I'm starting to get brain tired.
But to bring it back to the question that we were asked, what makes it a good book? Affording a good interpretation is it's something an interpretation that we can use. Being an American, gotta go with pragmatism, but how can we, if it's a useful book, like is it if it's useful for its particular interpretation, if it's useful for explaining something, maybe that's what makes a good history book.
Yeah, a good yeah, and I mean, I still think that as a supervisor said this to me too, you know, there's a lot of room also for people who are just good at writing narrative and good at writing, period. I feel like history puts more of an emphasis on that than, say, like biochemistry.
Yeah, definitely. If you ever, I mean, trying to read a lot of law and the lawyers cannot write. Well, they can write quite a bit. They can't write well.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, I think we had a really good chat. I don't know. I don't envy you. You said you're going to cut this up afterwards. But
Yeah, I'm gonna have a heck of a time trying to figure out what to keep and what not to. But I think this is a good place to end it. I'll stay in the comments, guys, to chat. But we've been doing this video-wise for 2 hours now.
Yep, I felt pretty productive. I feel like we
Yeah.
came to some interesting talking points.
Well, we definitely covered the whole academic bias thing. Basically, not as big of a deal as everybody makes it out to. Kind of necessary, and you know, doesn't hurt the profession.
Yeah, and makes a lot more sense in America than in any other country.
Yes. So, I guess that's it, guys. So thanks for joining. I'll go back down into the comments once we're done here and continue typing away.
Peace.
Bye.